I always thought I was careful in the woods. I had been hiking for years since I was a teenager, and I never took dumb risks. I checked the weather, packed more food than I needed, carried extra water, a good knife, and a basic first aid kit. I never pushed myself past my limits, and I always stuck to the marked trails. That last part was important. People who wandered off trail were the ones who got lost, injured, or worse. I didn't want to be one of those people. But sometimes all it takes is one small mistake. This trip was supposed to be simple. Just 2 days alone in the mountains. A solo getaway to clear my head. I had picked a trail in a national forest. A 12-mile loop that climbed up through thick pine forest before opening up into alpine meadows, with a campsite near a lake at the highest point. The plan was to hike in, camp for a night, then take the loop back down the next morning. Nothing crazy. I set out early in the morning, my pack snug against my back, my boots solid on the dirt path. The first few miles were peaceful, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. The air was cool, fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. I fell into a rhythm, my boots crunching against the packed dirt, my breathing steady. It was around mile 5 when I saw the side trail. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't marked. Just a thin path, barely wide enough for a single person, breaking off from the main trail and winding into the trees. It looked well-trodden, too clear to be an animal trail, but not maintained like the official paths. I stopped, frowning at it. I should have kept walking. Instead, I pulled out my map, double-checking the area. Nothing. No official trails, no old logging roads. Just solid forest. But the trail was there, and it looked recent, like people had been using it. I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of person who went off-trail, but something about it bothered me. If it was an unofficial path, where did it go? A shortcut? A dead end? My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the main trail and onto the narrow path. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The deeper I walked, the more the sounds of the forest seemed to disappear. No wind, no birds, just my footsteps. The path itself twisted through the trees, curving unnaturally, like it was made to disorient someone. I kept going, my stomach tightening for no good reason. 15 minutes passed, then 30. I should have turned around, but I didn't. That was my second mistake. The trail sloped downward, the trees growing closer together, the branches hanging low. Felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The air smelled different, like damp rot. The dirt beneath my boots turned soft, almost muddy. My instincts screamed at me to go back, but I had that hiker's stubbornness. I had already come this far. Might as well see where it led. Then I found the cabin. It was old, too old. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging, the door hanging open just a little. No signs of recent activity, no footprints, no tire tracks, no fire pit. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. Something was wrong with it. I could feel it. I don't know why I stepped closer. Maybe I wanted to see if anyone had been there recently. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. The air felt thick, humid. I could hear my own breathing, too loud in my ears. The door creaked when I pushed it. Inside, it was worse. The first thing I saw was the chair. Just a single wooden chair, sitting in the center of the room. Nothing else, no furniture, no bed, no stove. Just that chair. And the walls. The walls had scratches on them. Hundreds of them. Deep, uneven gouges, like someone had raked their fingernails across the wood over and over. Some marks were old, faded with time. Others looked fresh. Something moved behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. But there was nothing there. Just the trees outside, swaying slightly. The light was dim, like the sun had suddenly dipped lower in the sky. I needed to leave. Now, I backed out of the cabin, my pulse hammering. I turned, ready to follow the path back to the main trail. But it wasn't there. The trail was gone. I spun in circles, searching for it. I had just walked in from that direction. There should have been a clear path. But all I saw were trees. Thick, dark trees, pressing closer than before. My breath came in quick, uneven gasps. I wasn't stupid. I knew panic would make things worse. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I had a compass. I had my map. I could get back to the main trail if I stayed calm. I turned west, the direction I had come from. I pushed through the trees, branches scraping against my arms, my legs. I walked for 10 minutes, then 20. Then I saw the cabin again. I stopped dead. My brain refused to understand what I was seeing. I had walked away from it. I had been going in a straight line. And yet there it was. The same sagging roof. The same open door. The same chair, sitting in the middle of the room. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the direction anymore. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged. I tripped, hit the ground hard, scrambled up, kept going. Then suddenly the trees thinned. I stumbled onto solid ground. The real trail, the marked, official trail. I stood there, gasping, looking around. The sun was higher than before, the air cooler, normal, the way it should be. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I hiked out of there, faster than I ever had in my life, barely stopping until I reached my car. I never found that trail again. I checked maps, asked other hikers. No one knew about it. No one had ever seen an old cabin in those woods. But I know what I saw, and I know that if I had stayed any longer, I wouldn't have made it back. I had always loved camping. The stillness of the forest, the quiet of the night, the feeling of being alone but not lonely. There was something about it that made the rest of the world feel distant, unimportant. It was supposed to be simple, just a few days alone in the wild, away from everything. I had done it plenty of times before, but this trip was different. It started normally enough. I picked a remote area in a national forest, far from any roads or campsites. I wanted to be alone, away from other people. The drive out there was long, hours of winding roads through dense trees until I reached the trailhead. There were no other cars in the parking lot, which reassured me I had the place to myself. I checked my gear one last time before heading into the woods. My pack was heavy, loaded with everything I'd need. A tent, sleeping bag, extra food, a water filter, a first aid kit, a knife, a map, and a compass. I knew there wouldn't be any cell service, but I had marked my route carefully. I wasn't worried. The first few miles were easy. The trail was narrow but well-worn, cutting through towering trees and thick underbrush. The air smelled fresh, and the only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustling of animals in the bushes. I hiked for about 4 hours, deeper and deeper into the woods. The sun started sinking lower, and I found a spot near a small stream to set up camp. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of firewood, and easy access to water. I set up my tent quickly and gathered wood for a fire. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I sat by the flames, eating a simple meal and listening to the sounds of the forest. The quiet was peaceful, comforting. That night I slept well. I woke up once to the sound of something moving outside my tent, but it was distant, probably just an animal. I didn't think much of it and fell back asleep. The next morning I decided to explore. I packed a small bag with water, a snack, and my knife, then set off into the woods. There was no real destination. I just wanted to see what was out there. The forest was thick, the trees stretching high, their branches blocking most of the sunlight. I followed a small game trail, pushing through dense underbrush, stepping over fallen logs. It was beautiful, untouched. And then I found something strange. It was an old campsite. The tent was still there, collapsed, covered in leaves and dirt. A rusted pot sat near a fire pit, long cold. A backpack lay torn open, its contents scattered. I stopped. There were no signs of recent activity. No footprints, no fresh firewood. No indication that anyone had been here in a long time. But it didn't look abandoned by choice. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. I took a step closer. There was a boot, half buried in the dirt. Just one. No sign of the other. A cold feeling crept over me. I turned and left, moving quickly, my earlier excitement gone. I made it back to my camp before sunset, but the unease didn't fade. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had left in a hurry. Maybe they had an emergency. Maybe. That night I didn't sleep as well. Every little sound made me tense up. The rustling in the bushes, the creak of the trees, the snap of a branch. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a different sound. Something was moving, close. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was careful, deliberate. I held my breath, leaves crunching, a slow, steady sound. It was coming from just outside my tent. I lay there, frozen, every muscle in my body tight. Then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have fallen asleep, because when I woke up, the sun was rising. I unzipped the tent and looked outside. Nothing. But then I saw it. The firewood I had stacked was scattered. Not knocked over. Not disturbed by an animal. Scattered. I packed up immediately. I moved fast, retracing my steps back to the trailhead. The forest that had felt peaceful before now felt different. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, to see movement in the corner of my eye. I never did, but I felt watched the whole way back. When I reached the parking lot, my car was still there. The only car. I threw my pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I don't know who or what was out there with me. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. The drive to the cabin took nearly 6 hours. I had left the city early, hoping to reach the place by late afternoon, but the last stretch of road was nothing but gravel and potholes. It slowed me down more than I expected. My truck bounced and groaned over the uneven path, tires spitting dust and loose rocks. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. No houses, no other vehicles, not even an old hunting shack. Just miles of thick forest closing in from both sides, the trees growing taller and denser as I climbed higher into the hills. I had rented this cabin for a full week. I needed the break. Work had been draining me dry, and I couldn't stand the noise of the city anymore. I didn't want to hear cars honking or people yelling or the endless ringing of my phone. I wanted silence. I got what I asked for. The cabin was exactly as the listing described. Small, isolated, and simple. Just one room with a wood stove, a cot, and a table with 2 chairs. No electricity, no running water, just an old rain barrel outside that was half full from the last storm. A shed stood a few yards away, filled with firewood and rusted tools. The trees pressed in from all sides, thick and dark. The nearest town was over 40 miles away. I stepped out of my truck, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath. The air smelled fresh, damp with the scent of pine and earth. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just whined through the branches. Perfect. I grabbed my bags and stepped inside. The air was stale, like no one had been here in months. Dust floated in the slivers of sunlight cutting through the small, grimy window. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots as I set my gear down and took a look around. The cot was covered in an old wool blanket. A few dead leaves curled in the corners. The wood stove was cold, a few charred logs sitting untouched inside. A stack of old newspapers sat on the table, yellowed and brittle. I dropped my bag beside the cot and got to work setting up. I stacked firewood by the stove, filled the lantern with oil, and checked my food supply. I had packed everything I needed: canned beans, jerky, rice, a couple of protein bars. Enough to last the week. The first night, I kept things simple, heating up a can of chili on the stove and eating in silence. By the time the sun set, the forest outside had become a black wall. I hadn't realized how dark it would get without city lights. The cabin had only the lantern and the soft glow of the stove. Everything else beyond the window was pitch black. I stared out for a while, listening. Nothing, not even crickets. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went to bed early, listening to the crackling fire as I drifted off. I woke up to a sound. Something was moving outside. I stayed still, barely breathing. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. I listened, straining my ears. Soft footsteps, slow, careful, circling the cabin. I sat up, heart hammering. Could have been an animal, but something about the way it moved made me uneasy. It wasn't darting around like a raccoon or sniffing like a deer. It was deliberate. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the wooden walls. I stood up slowly and stepped toward the window, peering out. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I waited. The footsteps had stopped. I turned off the flashlight, climbed back into bed, and lay awake for hours listening. Morning came slow. The fire had died completely, and the air was cold. I sat up, stretched, and rubbed my eyes. My mind was still foggy from the restless night. Then I saw the footprints, right outside the cabin. They weren't mine. The dirt around the porch was soft from the recent rain, and the tracks were clear. They circled the entire cabin, stopping by the window before trailing off into the trees. My stomach twisted. It wasn't an animal. The prints were human, barefoot. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe some drifter had been passing through. Maybe a hunter had gotten lost. But why would someone be wandering barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I stepped onto the porch and looked around. The forest was still, the air heavy and damp. The tracks led toward the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had driven 6 hours to get here. I had planned this trip for months. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I had been half dreaming the footsteps in the night. I decided to stay. I spent the day keeping myself busy, chopped wood, cleaned up the cabin, took a short hike, making sure not to wander too far. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I made sure to lock the door. I woke up to the creaking of the porch. Someone was standing outside. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat. The floorboards groaned under slow, careful steps. Then silence. I reached for my flashlight, hands shaking, clicked it on. The light reflected off the window, blinding me for a moment. I squinted, heart pounding. Then I saw it. A face, pressed against the glass. Filthy. Smiling. I recoiled, my pulse slamming in my ears. By the time I grabbed the hatchet from beside my bed and turned back, the face was gone. I rushed to the window, shining my flashlight out. Nothing but empty woods. The trees swayed in the wind, branches creaking. I stood there for what felt like hours, gripping the hatchet, staring into the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light, I packed my bags. I didn't care about the rest of my trip. I didn't care about leaving food behind. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the trees. Then I saw them. More footprints. Not just one set. Dozens. They surrounded the cabin. Some led to the window. Others stopped at the door. My stomach turned. I had been surrounded all night. I grabbed my keys and sprinted to my truck, shoving my gear inside. When I turned the key, the engine sputtered, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, hands shaking. The wires had been cut. My chest tightened. My head felt light. I turned, scanning the trees. I saw nothing, but I felt them watching. I grabbed my bag, my hatchet, and started walking. The nearest road was miles away, but I didn't have a choice. I walked fast, then faster, then I ran. I didn't stop until I saw the first sign of civilization, a small gas station on the edge of town. I stumbled inside, breathless, hands shaking. The clerk gave me a strange look, but I didn't explain. I didn't know how to. I hitched a ride back to the city. Never went back for my truck. Never went back for anything. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but they had been close. Too close. I had always been drawn to the quiet of the mountains. Hiking alone gave me a kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. No noise, no distractions. Just the sound of my boots on the dirt, the wind in the trees, and the occasional rustle of an animal moving through the underbrush. This trip was supposed to be no different. A 3-day solo hike through a stretch of remote wilderness, a route I had mapped out weeks in advance. It wasn't a well-known trail, and that was the appeal. No crowded campsites, no people. Just me and the land. I parked my truck at the trailhead early in the morning, my pack loaded with everything I'd need: tent, food, water, a map, a compass. The sky was a dull gray, the air cool but not cold. Perfect hiking weather. The first few hours passed easily. The trail climbed steadily, winding through thick pine forests, crossing over small creeks and rocky slopes. The farther I went, the quieter everything became. By midday, I had reached a high ridge with a view that stretched for miles. Rolling hills, dense woods, the peaks of distant mountains. I ate a quick lunch, checked my map, and kept moving. The plan was simple. Follow the ridge for a while, then descend into the valley where I'd set up camp for the night. From there, I'd hike deeper into the forest, loop around the base of the mountains, and eventually make my way back. Should have been easy, but sometime in the afternoon, I realized something was wrong. The trail had started to fade. At first, it was subtle, the dirt path narrowing, the grass creeping in. Then it became worse. Fallen branches blocked the way. The ground became uneven, rocks and roots jutting up where they shouldn't have been. I checked my map again, frowning. The trail wasn't supposed to be like this. I pushed on, assuming it was just an overgrown section. Maybe fewer people had hiked this way recently. But the farther I went, the worse it got. Then, all at once, the trail was gone. I stopped, looking around. Nothing but thick trees, endless underbrush. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest. I had been following a clear path just minutes ago. There was no reason for it to just disappear. I took a breath, trying to stay calm. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I had my compass, my map. I could backtrack if I needed to. I turned around. The trail behind me was gone, too. That didn't make sense. I had just come from there. But now it was as if the forest had swallowed it up.
No footprints.
No broken branches. No sign that anyone had passed through. A knot formed in my stomach. I pulled out my compass, the needle spinning slightly before settling. I checked the map again, tracing my route. I had been heading west. If I kept moving in that direction, I'd eventually cross a stream marked on the map. I started walking. The forest grew denser, the trees pressing in closer. The ground was rough, sloping downward, forcing me to pick my steps carefully. The silence felt heavier now, as if the woods were listening. Minutes passed, then an hour.
No estream.
No trail, no sign of anything. I stopped, wiping sweat from my forehead. I had been hiking for hours. I should have reached the stream by now. I checked my compass again. The needle was pointing the wrong way. My breath caught in my throat. That wasn't possible. I tapped the compass, shook it slightly. The needle wobbled, then settled, still pointing in the wrong direction. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. Something was wrong. I had to get out of here. I turned sharply, deciding to head back the way I had come, even if I couldn't see the trail. I'd retrace my steps, find something familiar. But as I moved, nothing looked right. The trees all looked the same. The ground was uneven, sloping in ways that didn't match what I remembered. It felt like I was walking in circles, but I didn't stop. Then I heard it, a sound, a branch snapping. I froze. It had come from behind me. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. The forest was silent again. I stayed still, heart pounding, listening. Another sound. A footstep. Not mine. My skin crawled. I wasn't alone. I didn't move, didn't breathe. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, deep in the trees, I saw something. A shape, far away, barely visible through the branches. A figure, motionless, watching. A chill ran through me. I turned and started walking. Faster this time, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. The forest blurred around me as I moved. I stumbled, catching myself against a tree. My legs ached, my throat dry, but I kept going. Minutes passed, an hour. Then I saw something ahead, a structure, a cabin. I hesitated. It was old, weathered. No smoke from a chimney.
No lights.
But it was shelter. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. The door was slightly open. Pushed it wider, peering inside. Empty. Dust covered everything. A broken chair, a rusted stove, shelves lined with old, empty cans. And something else. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh. My chest tightened. Someone had been here. Recently. I backed away, stepping off the porch. The woods were silent. Then, in the distance, I saw movement. The figure. Closer now. Still watching. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. Not when my lungs burned. Not when my legs screamed for rest. I just ran. Somehow, I found my way back to the real trail. I didn't question it. I just ran. By the time I reached my truck, it was almost dark. I threw my pack into the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. I sat there, breathing hard, staring into the trees. Nothing moved, but I knew I had been followed, and I would never know why.